Also in the Queen's speech, new laws to crack down on psychoactive drugs known as legal highs. Anyone who produces or supplies them could face up to 7 years in jail. We've been speaking with Dr. Carl Hart, a scientist at Columbia University who believes in the decriminalization of certain drugs, and Neil McKegany, the founder of the Center for Drug Misuse Research, who favors a blanket ban. I began by asking Dr. Hart for his reaction to the Queen's speech law.
I mean, the vast majority of people who use drugs don't abuse drugs. They go to work, they are responsible citizens, and to have these blanket bans, it's an ignorant approach, really. I mean, we are, as thinking people, you figure out what the problem is, and then you precisely attack the problem.
Neil.
Well, the proposal here seems to be that we should target these drugs and ban them for those people who get into difficulties and accommodate or tolerate their use for people who don't get into difficulty. That may seem a rational approach, but quite frankly, we have no idea who is going to get into difficulty with these drugs. We can't predict who it is. We often don't know the chemical constituents of these substances. If they're highly addictive, then there will be a range of other problems that will surface in an individual's life. And banning them, actually, whether one likes it or not, whether one's an optimist about human nature or not, that has to be an important part of how we're tackling our drug problem.
I think there was some misinformation just said, right? When the comment the comment was that we can't predict who will get in trouble. You should know, I am a researcher, and I have given these drugs, these psychoactive drugs, thousands of doses of these drugs as part of my research. We know how to predict quite a bit about these drugs. We know under the conditions under which people will get in trouble. We know the conditions under which positive effects are more likely. So that's just simply not true. I'm sorry, I'm talking. And so to have these blanket approaches without being smart in targeting what the problem is, it's just not smart.
What about the point, Neil, that 90% of people who use drugs don't get into the sort of trouble you're describing?
Well, two things. It's quite different to supply these drugs in a research environment, to look at how they're used on the streets. You were a drugs worker in the past, John. You will know that there's no resemblance whatsoever to these two different contexts. On the streets, these drugs are highly dangerous and highly unpredictable. That may be different in a research environment. Now, can I also say the proposition that 90% of people who use these drugs don't get into difficulty, that is an absolutely fanciful statistic. I would like to see the evidence that identifies what proportion, precisely with that level of precision, of people get into difficulty.
The 80-90% figure is in your book.
Yes, the 80 to 90% figure is in my book. It's in statistics that have been collected worldwide, including the United States, for 50, 40 years at least. Anybody who studies drugs, they know this. This is not even controversial. And then back to the issue of the street drugs being different from the drugs that we study in the laboratory. Now, that should provide some evidence for us to look at precisely what's in the street drugs that's causing the problem. And when we think about what's in the street drugs that's causing the problem, what we will find is that the deaths are not being caused by the drugs that we already know. That's precisely my point. And so we should target those things that we are concerned about.
But in terms of prison, for example, prisons are absolutely rife with drugs. People actually get turned on in prison. And under your regime, more and more people go to prison.
Well, prison has to remain a punishment for serious cases of drug supply. But where there are people in prison who have a drug problem, the burden of responsibility is to ensure that we provide.
No, but the argument surely should be there is no point putting people in prison for drugs. I mean, where does it get you?
Sorry, John, I disagree. Unless one's going to say that if you commit a crime and you're not using drugs, you get prison. If you are using drugs, you get to get out of jail card for that reason. We don't have a two-tiered legal system in here. If you commit infractions, they receive due punishment. The responsibility on the government and on the prison service is to ensure that whilst in prison, people have access to the very best treatment. Now, we don't do as much on that front as we need to do.
Right.
But I don't think it's appropriate.
Let me put this to Carl.
Yeah, so the issue of drug enforcement being reduced there is just simply not true. I don't know if you've been reading the reports here. When we think about drug enforcement, the number of stops, for example, in this country in terms of drug enforcement, you have racial disparities and that sort of thing. Like, for example, nationwide, black people are 5 times more likely to be stopped by the police. as a result of drugs, in search for drugs. And in London itself, they're 3 times more likely to be stopped. So when we think about the way that we enforce drug laws in this country, as well as abroad, we know that these laws, for example, target various groups, and these laws are used in a way to continue to marginalize various groups. So I just don't accept your notion that we have reduced our drug enforcement. It's just simply not true.
I mean, that is a fair point, isn't it, Neil, in the sense that, I mean, you don't hear of the city guys who use coke, you don't hear of the Wall Street dealers and the rest of it. They don't get lifted. The people who get lifted are the black kids on the streets.
Yes, you're not wrong in that respect. I do think that we adopt a very ill-advised tolerance of drug use in the higher echelons of society. And there is a hypocrisy there. But the resolution of that hypocrisy isn't to seek the legalisation, decriminalisation of drugs elsewhere in society. It's to actually impose the existing drug laws in a fairer, a more uniform fashion.
Carl, Hart and Neil McKegany, thank you very much indeed